Welcome to Living Your Policy, sharing your policies, and training your team. We are so excited to learn with this community today. I'm Samantha Weil, SRE Network's community manager, and I use she, her pronouns. For those of you who are new to SRE Network, welcome. We're so thrilled to have you learn with us today. SRE Network is a Jewish network of 160 plus organizations rooted in a shared commitment to safety, respect, and equity for all. We inspire meaningful change in workplaces and communal spaces by bringing people together to address gender-based harassment, discrimination, and inequity through an intersectional lens of gender justice. Our work is focused on strategic community investments, research and learning, and community building. In this session today, which is 90 minutes, we will explore how to communicate your policies and train your staff. We'll cover developing strategies for this work, best practices, the considerations and steps for your planning process, and concrete ways to communicate your policies and educate your staff. Today's session will be recorded so those unable to join us can learn as well. And if you need closed captions, please click the CC button at the bottom of your screen to enable those. Building safe, respectful, and equitable workplaces and communal spaces is a long-term journey, and we are all learners discovering what works and doesn't, asking questions, facing challenges, and navigating this new path together. As partners on this shared journey, we ask you to help us create a brave space, to share your experience and ideas, what's worked well and what hasn't, so we can learn from our collective experiences. We hope today you'll help us create this brave space by participating in the many interactive portions of this training. If you wish to share anonymously at any point in time or ask a question anonymously, please direct message our speakers. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce our speakers from our partners at Sacred Spaces. Sacred Spaces provides Jewish institutions with the professional services necessary to develop robust policy and training to prevent opportunities for abuse and guide them responsibly should abuse occur. Today, we have the privilege to learn with Amee Wurzburg, the program director at Sacred Spaces, and Stephanie Gray, the Keilim program manager. Please read their full bios in the chat. And now, it's my true pleasure to pass it over to Amee and Stephanie.
Thank you so much, Samantha. Hi, everyone. My name is Stephanie Gray. I use they, them pronouns. As Samantha said, I'm the Keilim program manager here at Sacred Spaces. I am calling in from occupied Osage and Cato land, also known as Arkansas. And I will let Amee introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. My name is Amee Wurzburg. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the program director at Sacred Spaces, and I'm calling in from Silver Spring, Maryland.
Great. I think we are ready to start the slides. Thank you so much. We can go to the next slide. All right, so just to go over the introductions of kind of what we're going to be covering today. So we're going to look at our community of practice, and this is how we kind of frame all of our trainings here at Sacred Spaces, looking at how we build and talk about organizational culture. And then we're going to go into the kind of overview of how Keilim works, what the toolkit is, how you can use it, and then go specifically into our 6th sub-module, which is living your policy, which is why we're here today, of going specifically into sharing your policy and also education and training on the policy. Next slide, please. So when we're looking at the agenda, here's some major learning objectives, and this is a really great tool that you can use when you're doing training within your own organization of really what are we trying to get out of this training and what are the goals. So one is looking at the considerations for sharing your policy and also looking at how your organization is communicating about your policy and making sure that it's actually being communicated and not just living kind of on a page. We'll also look at the importance of creating an education and learning strategy, that a lot of what we're going to be talking about today is looking at why these things should not just be a one-off sort of effort, is that there has to be a really larger plan and strategy that your organization is committed to, especially around anti-harassment and discrimination as well. And then specific strategies. I think everybody comes to workshops like these because they really want concrete tools that they can take back to their organizations. And so we're really going to be identifying specific strategies that your organizations are able to take. Next slide, please. So when looking at our community of practice, as I said before, that this is really a model that we use when we interact in all of our trainings, workshops here at Sacred Spaces and with Keilim, of really being able to bring your full self to the space and really being able to participate fully. And what does that look like? So really prioritizing the respect of everybody in the space. Of everybody comes from this with their own experiences, perspectives, identities, and making sure that we're really cognizant of when people share something, that's coming from their own experience, and also that we're not sharing ideas, experiences without other people's consent. So making sure that we're speaking from our own experience and not speaking on behalf of other people. And also looking at what is shared here stays here, and what is learned here leaves here. So if we're learning about a very specific example from an organization, that will stay in the space. But if you learned a lesson of, oh, this is a great example of how we can share our policy, you can definitely share that outside of this space. And also taking care of yourself, that in any of the work that we do here at Sacred Spaces, it's incredible. It's very critical to be able to make sure that you're doing what you need to be able to fully participate in that space. And if that means having your Zoom camera off, if that means taking notes or doodling or walking around during the call, anything that you need to do for yourself to make this presentation as accessible as possible, please go ahead and do that. And as Samantha said earlier in the call, if you have an anonymous question or some anonymous feedback that you would like to provide, please reach out via direct message here in the chat to Amee, and she'll be able to talk about that and get those questions answered. Next slide, please. So when we're thinking about the idea of organizational culture, it can often be a kind of lofty conversation and can sometimes be hard to figure out, how do we want to get to this point that we want our organization to be at, of a healthy culture that's grounded in safety, respect, and equity, that can sometimes seem too unattainable. And so if we look at these kind of 4 core ways of how we sort of achieve some of this organizational change, first is like the belief that safe spaces are possible. And I think oftentimes like that's a challenge of like recognizing that we can have sacred spaces, that is possible, that we're able to achieve that. And then the idea that we can just ground that belief that change is possible in the shared values that we have. And I think as Jewish organizations, there's such a rich tradition to be able to provide some of the framing of what are our shared values. And I think that once we have those conversations about values and the shared belief that change is possible, oftentimes when we talk about expectations, that's really where we can, like, in concrete ways, think about, here's how we can co-create what we expect from one another and what we want to have in our communities. And when we look at practices, that's really what the Keilim toolkit is about writing policy, but really codifying in your daily operations and your protocols how we actually want to live these values and expectations that we have for our community. Next slide, please. So when we're thinking about Keilim, so Keilim actually hasn't been around too long. It was launched in March of 2022, so almost less than a year we've been fully up. And so basically what the toolkit is if you go to the website that Amee just listed in the chat, you can find the full toolkit. And so it was launched in last year, which guides organizations to develop policies and procedures that create safer, more respectful, and more equitable environments. So basically, the overview of the toolkit is going through, here are different ways that you can help create your policy and really adapt language that we have provided here at Keilim and Sacred Spaces, of being able to adapt that for your own organization. And even within less than a year, we have had very great traction with the website of being able to really connect with people all over the world. And so we've had 58 countries already reached, 849 cities across the world, and over 3,500 users access the website over the last year. So we're really able to make a big impact, I think, across the world and across Jewish organizations. And anybody is able to access Keilim. It is completely free to use. And all of the content that is on the website is always available. So next slide, please. So going over a little bit of an overview of what the website looks like if you go to the Keilim modules. So we have 6 modules. Not all of them are completed, but each of the modules, so we have foundational elements, prohibited conduct, interaction guidelines, screening, organizational response, and living your policy. Today, we're only going to be specifically talking about module 6. But for the other modules, for each of them, there are considerations that are listed for each of the submodules within it. So for example, for foundational elements, the first submodule is looking at creating a Keilim committee. So within that first submodule, there are considerations to take. There is sample language that you can use to include in your policy. And then there are supporting resources that you can use to help also codify some of the language within the modules. You can go to the next slide, please. So if we're specifically looking at module 6, that we really saw a huge need of getting to this organizational culture piece. And I think that a lot of organizations are coming to us and saying, okay, we have a policy, but what do we do with it now? And so really the Living Your Policy module is really addressing some of those concerns and those needs of how are we actually bringing these policies to life. And so there are 3 submodules within the Living Your Policy module. So 1 is education and training, 2 is sharing your policy, and 3rd is review and revision. Today we'll only be talking about the first 2. But really thinking that even the best policies are going to need to be updated and adapted and reviewed to stay up to date with the needs of where the organization is and where it's going. And also even the best policy isn't effective if you're not sharing it with your community and everybody knows what's in the policy and what those shared expectations and values are. So we're again thinking, how do we make this relevant to the day-to-day operations of how our organization is running? Next slide, please. So I will be specifically talking about sharing your policy, and later on in the call, we're going to hear from Amee talking more about education and training. So here are some of the major questions when we were formulating the submodule of what are the questions an organization is going to be asking in terms of how they disseminate their policy. And so we came up with these 3 major questions. One is, when are you sharing your policy? How are you sharing your policy? And who are you sharing your policy with? And so these are really the major considerations that are within this submodule. And so we can go to the next slide. And when we're thinking about when are we sharing your policy, this is really a timing question. And so thinking about, we do have a poll of, I would like to hear of how often is your organization sharing your policy? And we have a couple of choices here, and we'd just like to hear, see where folks are sort of at right now with yeah, I'm seeing quite a few yearly, and then also seeing a lot of we don't have a schedule. And so maybe like this is important of like why we're having this call of like why is it important to have a schedule of sharing your policy? And so yeah, so we have 32% yearly, 14% multiple times a year, 10% unsure, 45% we don't have a schedule. And so when we're thinking about sharing our policy, it's important that we're both sharing our policy at regular intervals and folks know when the policy is going to be shared out. As I said earlier, how often your policy is being shared is really important and critical in the sense of if you have a policy, but folks don't know when it's being shared out or how to access it, your policy really isn't going to be effective. And so some considerations of thinking about how often should you be sharing your policy can really depend upon thinking about how recently was your policy created. If it's a new policy, you may want to be sharing your policy more often. So there's more accessibility of folks realizing, oh, the Keilim committee just put out a new policy. I think having more regular opportunities for the community to engage with it can be really, really beneficial. And then thinking about once you kind of get the initial feedback from the community from how they view the policy, some additions, revisions that can be made to the policy, then you can perhaps create a more regular schedule of, as many organizations here are doing yearly, that's a really good kind of frame for how often you can be sharing your policy. And one of the other considerations that we think about also is if you have new hires, are you sharing your policy with your new hires in their onboarding process, in their welcome packet? How are you making sure that folks that are new to the organization, one of the first things that they're able to really consider and look at is their policy? This can also be for new members for a synagogue. This can also be for new volunteers working at a museum or a JCC, for example. Next slide, please. And one of the other big questions that we get is, okay, we should share a policy, but how are we going to do that where it's the most effective and people can really see it? And so there are a couple different points that we have here of how an organization can distribute their policy. So obviously thinking about formal distribution, that can include emailing about the policy, including the policy and a hard copy within the front office, of leaving other copies in other places that might be accessible for folks that are coming into the organization. Another also form of like formal distribution we can think of is including executive summaries along with the policy that are also written alongside the full policy or an abridged version that is also possible. Also thinking of formal and informal education. This is, and Amy will talk about this later, thinking of skill building, trainings, visual summaries. One of the things that we've seen with organizations is posting signs around the building of saying, we just put out a new policy. Here's a QR code. You can scan the QR code and go straight to the policy or the executive summary and read more about it. We also have an example of an organization that we've worked with that was a synagogue that actually produced short YouTube videos for each of the sections of the policy and really went into depth of why we created this section of the policy. What is the policy saying? How can you get engaged with what this part of the policy is saying? And we've seen that that has been really, really beneficial for their community of being able to engage on a community-wide level with the policy. Discussion-based, this can also sort of go hand in hand with that as well, I think, of thinking about focus groups, community sessions, explaining each of the sections within the policy and making sure that folks are able to ask questions and provide some context there. And also because we're Jewish organizations, it can be really important to ground all of this in our Jewish values. So thinking about text studies on a Saturday morning Torah study, what if we tie that week's Parsha to thinking about this specific section in the policy? That can be really beneficial. So one of the things at Sacred Spaces that we have is a Judaic study guide, which has tons of resources, text studies, and other resources of thinking about having some of these conversations around safety, respect, and equity rooted in Jewish text. So feel free to kind of go through and browse some of those resources. That can also be really helpful, as Amy just linked in the chat, of being able to look at that and think about some new examples that you could use of tying some of the work you're already doing in these Jewish spaces to thinking about the policy and how those can interconnect with one another. Another example that we have from an organization is that they, within their synagogue and within their day school, actually included each section of their policy was titled in Hebrew, had a transliteration and an English translation as well. And for each of the buildings or each of the rooms in the building had a different Jewish value that was tied to their policy. Again, just thinking of how we can bake in some of these conversations into kind of how the actual infrastructure of the building looks is really tied to the fundamental values that are found in the policy. Next slide, please. So I would love to hear within the chat, feel free to add some of your comments of what your organization has done to share your policy, some innovative ideas, or if you've sort of had some issues of sharing your policy, would love to hear those too. Yeah, feel free to use the chat. We have a really good group of people, good number of people here. So I think we can get a lot of good ideas, sort of brainstorm. Spoke about the policy during a Yom Kippur morning sermon. That's really great. Yeah, I see that we have a good group of different types of organizations here. So I think that can be really interesting. Of a synagogue might approach this very differently than a museum or a JCC. or another nonprofit. We publicize the policy annually to the community. We include it in the registration packet for our annual conference and retreat. That's a really great idea. Onboarding annually for staff. I tend to work with various organizations. They tend to use training as a gateway or onboarding materials with new staff. Yeah, I think that this gets a lot into sort of some of the next things that we're going to be talking about. Who are you actually sharing your policy with? And I think that there's some really great ideas of thinking about staff, thinking about new hires. We do a yearly review of the policy as well. That's great. Getting into the third submodule of living your policy. It's important to do yearly reviews. Great. These are some really great responses, and I think some really great ideas. We can go ahead to the next slide. And so, yeah, this is the question of who are you sharing your policy with? And so I think a lot of folks in the chat were talking about staff. There are also lots of other groups that you can be sharing your policy with. And again, this is really going to be dependent upon what kind of organization you have and kind of how tied it is with community members, volunteers, contractors, those sorts of things. But I would love to hear of who all you're sharing your policy with. There's a poll, and you can actually choose multiple different parties. So I'd love to hear what folks, who folks are sharing your policy with. The board. Yeah, pretty unanimous that everyone is sharing your policy with staff, which is important. A good amount with the board, some volunteers I'm seeing, non-members. There are a couple folks that have said other. If you're saying other, I would love to hear in the chat what those other groups are, because I think that could be an interesting example for some other folks and maybe other considerations. Yeah, I think that very much covered as if you have a staff, your staff needs to be reading your policy, but I think it's also thinking about who all is going to be impacted by your policy is also a really important question when thinking of who you're sharing your policy with. Members, yes, thank you, Rabbi. With our constituents, volunteers, are a vulnerable group, and sometimes organizations may not remember this. I think that that's a really important point. Thank you. Who is most directly going to be impacted by your policy? I think, as it was stated in the chat, staff is like what comes to our mind first, oftentimes board as well, but members, volunteers, folks that may be most vulnerable or mostly impacted by abuse, discrimination, harassment, sometimes are what can often be left on the margins. So when we're thinking about creating a really inclusive and transparent policy around sharing our policies, these are some questions to really consider of not just safety, but also looking at respect, equity, these lenses of how people are going to be most affected by what's in the policy. If you have a reporting structure, as we're encouraging organizations to do, anybody that comes into contact with your organization may at some point need to report an instance of abuse or harassment or discrimination. If a volunteer experiences that at, let's say, an event that your organization is doing, but they don't have access to the policy or don't know where to find it, then that actually is getting in the way of them being able to report. And that, again, if we're thinking about this kind of organizational culture piece of how are we working to live our values of wanting folks to be able to really fully participate in our spaces and feel safe in our spaces, everybody needs to know, here are the mechanisms. If there is a violation of policy, or even figuring out, was this a violation of policy? Do I even know what the policy says? Of thinking that we need to have a really expansive view of who's actually able to view the policy. And that's also thinking, though, not everybody is going to need the full policy. Some organizations that are in this call may have a policy that's 60, 70 pages. A volunteer for a couple of events with your organization may not need to know all 70 pages of your policy, but making sure that if you can create abridged versions of the policy, visual summaries of the policy that are accessible to volunteers or contractors coming in, of making sure that kind of those policy sections that are most important and most applicable to various kinds of groups are being shared. And so thinking again, as I said, are there different formats? This can also include if you're working with youth specific organizations, if you have youth volunteers, and making sure that it's accessible to them in a readable format. Oftentimes policies can kind of get stuck in a sort of legalese, so making also sure that your policy is readable and that it's readable for every sort of group that you're coming into contact with and sharing your policy with. Because again, if we're thinking about, we want an organization where we feel transparent, where we are advocating for a transparency and accountability and creating safe communities together, right? Creating a policy is not just about the people that are initially writing the policy and sharing it out. It's about hearing from the entire community and all of those that will be impacted. So making sure that you're hearing from the full spectrum of stakeholders and making sure that everybody has access to know what the policy states. We can go to the next slide, please. So these next couple slides are just some example language that we have on Keilim, and you can actually just find this language directly on Keilim. And so part of what we want to do with providing sample language, drafting language, is really saying, here is what we have seen can work. Really adapt this for your own organization and be able to tailor it for your own event or policies, things like that. So this is just some sample visitor language that we have seen other organizations that we've worked with use that have been really beneficial. So this can be included. I know some folks in the chat talked about a retreat or a conference, that this can be something really important. This could be a sign that's posted regularly around the event space. This can be included in the packet for the retreat, of thinking about how to make sure that new visitors or new members are aware of what the policy or what the policy is actually stating and how they can make sure that they feel safe in the space. So thinking about that the organization is pledging to creating safe, respectful, and equitable environments, and we encourage reporting of problematic interpersonal conduct, where they can find the policy. So this could be a website, this could be a hard copy, this could be a QR code, lots of different ways that we could approach of how folks would be able to access it in multiple different ways, because that can also be important. And also thinking about if there is a policy violation, who do I report to? So making sure that there's a lot of clarity in the policy as well. If somebody is coming and thinking, I need to report something, there should be very clear, concrete steps within the policy of how someone can do that. Next slide, please. So this is also another sort of sample language. And so a lot of organizations recently have been working to create affirmation statements. So making sure that this could be for employees, this could be volunteers, members of the synagogue, other community members, parents within a day school, lots of different folks that could be kind of included in this. It's really up to your organization to determine kind of who do you think would most benefit of making sure that everybody who reads this signs this affirmation statement, basically stating that I have acknowledged that I received the policy, that I recognize what is in the policy, and I affirm to, and I commit to contributing to making sure that if there is any violation of policy, that I will be accountable and working to the, making sure that agreeing to the terms within the policy. And again, thinking of this cultural piece of I commit to contributing to a culture of safety, respect, and equity. And part of the power, I think, of having these sample affirmation statements or the previous language and even the drafting language on the next slide is thinking about, it really says something when your organization is committed to a kind of meta conversation of, I'm not only producing this policy as an organization, but I'm also internally committing to making sure that I'm actively sharing the policy as an organization, that folks are reading the policy and affirming with it, and also continuing to review, continuing to educate around the policy. A lot of these kind of accountability measures or transparency measures that organizations can do of, I'm not just writing the policy, I'm really wanting to bring the policy to life. And you can go to the next slide, please. And that's where some of this draft policy language, and you would find this in the drafting section on the submodule, is really codifying that language that I'm really talking about here, that everybody that we see fit. This can be staff, board, community members. Will be provided with a copy of this policy and the name of a staff member who can answer questions about the content. Also thinking about including the affirmation statement within your policy, indicating that they've read, received, and understood the policy. And again, putting in language in the policy that it will be shared at this point, this time. And I know a lot of folks in the chat were saying that they're doing it regularly or don't have a schedule. This is really where you can codify that schedule. And again, one of the great things about a policy is that it can always be changed. It can always be adapted. And if something doesn't work, if you find, oh, every 6 months we're going to share the policy and we put that in your policy and you find that's too many times, like you can also just change your policy to adapt it to ways that actually work better for your organization. And I know that, and one of the framings I really appreciated Samantha talking about at the beginning was like the idea of creating brave spaces, of thinking about how we can kind of integrate some of this work and learn from one another. And I think oftentimes we can get caught up in this idea of a fear of failure, a fear of messing up, or fear of like, we're not going to do something exactly right. And I think one of the great things about thinking of living your policy is that recognition that we will make mistakes as organizations, like that will happen and things will not be perfect. And the policy is never going to be perfect, but it's about adapting. It's about listening. It's about making changes as you hear from the community and from those that are most impacted by the policy. And I think that there can be some really great generative sort of work of recognizing we're going to put this in the policy and we're going to see how it works. And if it works well, great, we'll keep it. And if it doesn't, we'll just change it and kind of move to what the organization most needs. And so I think that that can be the benefit of thinking about this policy. Language is not set in stone, but just a kind of a stepping stone for the larger work of making sure that you're educating, talking about your policy, regularly sharing about it, hearing from people and getting feedback. I think that this is all part of the process of what it really means to live your policy. Next slide, please. And so we're going to go into some breakout rooms. And I really want folks within these rooms to feel like they can really share a lot of what they're hearing, doing in their organizations. What are some barriers or challenges your organization has faced when sharing your policy? As well as, do you have any ideas of what you could implement? We brought up some really interesting ideas, some examples from other organizations. Do you think that those could work in your organization? What are some other ideas that you have? The breakout room will be 7 minutes. And so we will debrief, and I would like to hear from folks if they feel comfortable sharing afterward, but also no expectation to share afterwards or debrief. So we can really hope that folks can speak freely in the groups and really share some of the ideas, some of the challenges that they've been facing. Before I open it up to breakout groups, are there any questions before we go in? Not seeing any, so I think that we are good to go out into the breakout rooms. Julie, if you want to, you can definitely feel free to add some thoughts in the chat if you feel comfortable, some ideas maybe that were thrown out in the group. Also, just leaving this space also for some questions, if there are any kind of questions about sharing your policies, dissemination sort of ideas. I know that I kind of went through things pretty quickly, and this is like a really big step that organizations have to really consider. So feel free to ask any questions. You can come off mute, add them to the chat, and then we'll head into Amee's section on education and training, which I'm sure people will have lots of questions about, because that's something that we get a lot of questions about at Sacred Spaces. And I also want to offer that if you aren't thinking about questions right now, within the slides are my email, Amy's email, and our Keilim email as well. So if you have a question after this webinar and you're like, oh, I should have asked that during the thing, but didn't think about it, you can always email me. I'm happy to answer any questions about navigating the toolkit, anything that's on it, and answering any questions, working with your organization on some of these pieces as well. I think it can be sometimes stressful, like, oh, if I don't get this opportunity now to ask a question, it will never get answered. I promise you that that is not going to happen. I'm always here to answer any questions that folks have. I'm not seeing anything in the chat. So Amee, do you feel good about kickstarting your part?
Sure, fantastic. And thank you for screen sharing, Julianne. I think one more slide. One more slide. Perfect. All right, so we're now going to transition into talking about education and training. And this is one of my favorite topics. And it's also where we find we get some of the most questions, where organizations reach out to us and say, we know we should be providing information and education on our policies, but how do we do that? And how do we do that effectively? And so I want to start by sharing this quote as a frame. So as individuals, we count the days, but as leaders, we must count the years, by Rabbi Jonathan Sacks. And I really like this quote because I think it captures strategy, which is really the word I want you to keep in mind during this section. And so part of our role as leaders is about being able to zoom out and understand the bigger picture and really always having the long term in mind. And this is especially key when thinking about violence prevention work, because we know it takes effort and time to make real effective change. And so our goal is to not only count the days, but make sure we're also always having the years in mind as well. Next slide, please. So I want to start by talking about what we know, what research tells us about training for thinking about anti-harassment and discrimination. And the truth is there's not a huge body of literature, but there is enough to know the following. And this is also knowing too that the research is often measuring different things and types of training. So there's still a lot of room for growth in this field. But the truth is what we do know about looking at trainings, especially around sexual harassment, is that it's actually not always very encouraging when pointing to training as a methodology. And so what this means though, is it can really help us create more effective strategies for when we do train. So let's look at what the research tells us. So we know that that training alone is often not effective for behavior change. So if we want to actually change how people treat one another, a training in itself is not going to have that effect. What we also know is that a lot of trainings focusing on anti-harassment and discrimination don't address inequalities and power dynamics. And what we know from the research is when this is left out, it makes training less effective. And that's because it's not exploring the root causes of why harassment and discrimination happens. And so it's really important when we are doing training that we're talking about things like structural factors, oppression, inequalities, and power dynamics. We also know that training can help increase knowledge and reporting. And this is especially true if it's followed up with other steps. And so this is a really promising sign of when can we use training and when might it be more effective. And we also know that training on its own does not have a significant impact on attitudes. And so we know that changing attitudes and beliefs is really challenging. And that it's often, very deeply ingrained in our culture and our society. And so one training is not going to necessarily change how people view something, even though it can play a role potentially in questioning certain attitudes. And so what this means is that we really need to make sure that we're relying on the best evidence possible to make our education and training effective. Because otherwise we're really risking things like wasting resources, having potential backlash or even unintended consequences. So that could be things like increased resistance to future training. And it also means that we aren't doing what's best for our workplaces and for people who experience sexual harassment and discrimination. And so that's why I really want this next section to be focused on thinking about how do we root our strategies in what the research says, which is not that training is ineffective, but that it needs to be part of a holistic strategy to serve its purpose. And we need to be really thoughtful and intentional when we decide to use training as our methodology. Next slide, please. So I want to give an overview of kind of what we're going to cover. And then we're going to dive in and we're going to do a lot of scenarios and a lot of conversation in the chat for this section. So first, we're going to talk about why do we need an education plan? And we're going to discuss this together. We're also going to talk about who is learning. So thinking about what staff to include and thinking about things like ensuring leadership is not exempt. And also that there might be people who need additional training, so such as leadership and supervisors who might need extra training on things like reporting or legal requirements. We're also going to be thinking about what are we asking people to learn. So thinking about the scope and what to cover. We got a lot of questions about that, and really thinking about how do you prioritize what topics since we can't do everything at once. And so we're going to really talk about the role of assessment there and kind of how can you support buy-in by having staff involved in the process of deciding what to cover. And then we're going to talk about when. So thinking about timing, thinking about scheduling and follow up. And then we're really going to talk about the effectiveness and what do we know are effective strategies for learning and training that you can take back to your organization. So next slide, please. So I would love for folks to share in the chat if you could share, why do organizations need an educational strategy to prevent and respond to workplace harassment and discrimination? So if someone's feeling particularly brave and wants to come off mute, please feel free, but also I would love to see as many thoughts as possible in the chat. So take a second and really think about that. Why do organizations need a strategy? I am seeing Rebecca raising your hand. Would you like to come off mute and share?
Yeah, I was going to say what I think Rachel's putting in the chat, but it seems to me, I mean, based on what you all shared, which is that sort of like piecemeal efforts, like training here, training there, are actually really not that effective in impacting organizational culture, and that you need a holistic strategy that has multiple interventions at multiple stages to really take a holistic approach. And I think what I've seen is that a lot of organizations actually just sort of say, like, we did this one training with X consultant or X organization and now we're done. And so I think moving away from that toward a more holistic, consistent approach is really healthy for the community.
That was wonderful. You captured so many things in that. I especially like that you talked about moving from a piecemeal approach and sort of just one-offs and really looking at it holistically. And I'm seeing some amazing things in the chat, so I'll just read off a few. So we know training alone is not sufficient to change attitudes. We want everyone to understand why we care about this. That strategy means structure. And so all people know the ground rules and where to go if an issue comes up and what will be done. Also seeing that this work can be addressed ad hoc and reactively and not necessarily connected to the larger work mission and values of the organization. That's fantastic, because that's also really connecting strategy to the values we hold as leaders and as organizations. And often not approaching it as sort of a checklist, because we know that that in itself is not going to change behavior. So these are fantastic answers and really captured a lot of the why. There's just a couple of key things I want to highlight. And so an education strategy really gets to the culture piece within an organization. And so we need to embed in organizational practices to shape that organizational culture, and creating a strategy is a way to do that. And then it's also showing your commitment and dedication to staff safety, well-being, equity, as well as everyone's development. And it's also showing, as was already said, that we can't do it all at once. So we know shifts in power and culture take time, and that strategy shows our commitment to really doing this work effectively. Next slide, please. All right, so now we're going to talk about building an organizational culture of learning. So I think we've kind of addressed the why. We know it's important, but how do we actually do this? And so we know that we want organizations and workplaces that are committed to learning and change and feedback. And so this is a way of showing that it's a priority, we're putting in effort, and that we're also really committing to our organizational values, and really showing that we see where maybe there's places to grow as well. So how do we do this? So thinking about these steps. So the first is building that strategy. So part of that is codifying it and actually having it be part of your policy. So showing that you're committed to making sure that you're providing learning and educational opportunities focused around prevention and response. It's also really about being strategic. And so thinking about what should be a training and what shouldn't be, and how to decide. And we're going to actually talk more about that. But I think really pulling out that strategic piece in the word strategy. And then there's thinking about budgeting. So really making sure, as you're thinking about budgets, having a line item really committed to education and training, thinking about what's the commitment for organizational resources and how often showing that financially is a way of demonstrating values. And that this also includes paying, if you're going to use outside trainers, paying what people are worth, and really making sure you're fairly compensating them for their time and their work and expertise. And then lastly is thinking about that time frame piece. And so this is really thinking about making sure that you're choosing times that are accessible for everyone, and you're ensuring everyone is present and that people aren't exempt from this kind of training. And so really showing that committing that time and money is a really important way of kind of showing values and commitment. So we're going to get more into this. So next slide, please. All right, so we're going to talk about scope. And so this is really thinking about who learns and kind of what content is covered. So we're going to start by talking about minimum requirements. And I just want to note that this can vary by state laws or sometimes jurisdictions. So make sure that you're really knowing kind of what legally is required of you. But so at minimum, what you want to make sure you're providing education on is really the basics. So what the policy is, what it covers, where to find it, and how to report. And so these are really just the basics. And so making sure, and you'll notice that these are all kind of knowledge-based. And so you really want to make sure that everyone can say, we know we have a policy, we know it covers this type of behavior, I know where to find it, and I know that if something does happen to me or someone else, I know how to report, I know what those mechanisms look like. And it's also really important to note that you also want to reinforce this information. And so often when we learn something once, we don't always remember it. And so you want to make sure too that people aren't only receiving these minimum requirements just one time. But so we also know those are the minimum requirements and that we really want to go beyond that because we really want to look at what's going to be most effective. And so that is really going above and looking at how do we do things like address and discuss root causes. We want to look at organizational culture, and we also want to provide people with skills to recognize and interrupt harm, which folks might have also heard as bystander intervention. And so these are things that start to get to more of those root causes of why abuse might happen and how to address it. And so we're going to talk a little bit more about these things. But so I would like, let's see, we're going to share a resource in the chat about kind of different topics. And we're not going to necessarily go into all of these. And that's really because I want to emphasize that when you're trying to decide what topics make sense for your organization, it might be really specific and it really might be something that you need tailored to your organization and sort of what's happening. So for example, this is really where assessment is helpful. So thinking maybe you survey staff or you ask staff in one-on-ones what are topics they want training on or where they're seeing things or where they feel there might be gaps. Because we can't cover everything. And we know that's also where the strategy piece is we're not going to do this all in one educational opportunity, you know, or even in 1 year. We really want to be thinking holistically over a longer time. You also want to make sure that it's really fitting the needs of your organization. So some examples of topics that could be covered could be things like how to have difficult conversations, how to give and receive feedback, learning about microaggressions and how to recognize and respond to them, thinking about bystander practices, thinking about what is implicit bias and how might it show up in our practices. For folks who are doing hiring, really learning what are best practices for equitable hiring, and things like recognizing and promoting fairness for supervisors. So those are just some examples of what content you might want to be covering, but it's really going to be specific for your organization and your needs and that specific time. That's actually one thing we know that's also really important about effectiveness is that it's really tailored to the folks that it's intended for. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that. Next slide, please. All right. So we've talked a little bit about the why, and we've talked about kind of what, but we're really going to now focus on what are the effective strategies. So we know from research there are certain things that are more or less effective. So how do we really lean into what the literature tells us is more effective? And so the first is skill building. And I was going to ask for a definition, but we've got the definition here. So I'm just going to read this out loud, which is a training technique that provides specific and clear guidance on how to do something, as well as opportunities to practice and receive feedback. It goes beyond simply telling people what not to do or even what to do. And so skill building is a really effective technique. And this says training, which it does make training more effective, but I would also say it's an effective technique really for any type of education or learning opportunity. And what we know is that people are more likely to retain information if they feel they're able to apply it. So we're going to think a little bit about this and we're going to practice. So next slide, please. All right, so here's a scenario. You are designing a training for managers on how to respond to disclosures of experiencing harassment and discrimination and their reporting obligations. How can you integrate skill building into your training? So feel free to come off mute or put in the chat of what you might do if you have decided that it's going to be a training and you know you want to put skill building in there. Seeing role playing, that's great. Thank you for adding that in. What else? Case studies, fantastic. So role playing is giving people an opportunity to practice. So for example, that could be a manager and one of the people that they supervise having a conversation. There's a scenario there, and then practicing actually how they might respond to a disclosure. And then a case study could be a conversation kind of like this, of really looking at something and being able to pull out maybe what someone did really well, maybe areas where they could strengthen their response. And so a couple of other things that's really important with skill building is so you don't want to jump straight into a role play or a scenario because you want to make sure people have the content so they can apply it. So thinking about for this particular training, it's on responding to disclosures. So you want to give people the knowledge about here's things to do and here's things not to do, and here's your role, and then letting them kind of build up to practicing it. And then the other piece that's really important is getting feedback, because we're not always going to be good or perfect at things the first time we do something. And so it's really important that as you're building and skill building, people are getting the opportunities to get feedback and practice and improve. Yes, and I'm seeing also considering different options on how to respond and discussing why each works, does not work. This is great. This is a lot more interactive than just being told, here's what your role is, here's what you should do and not do, that's it. This is really integrating ways for people to apply those skills and really see what it's going to look like in their job, and also give them a chance to practice before they apply it. And that's really key, because we aren't always going to be able to do things the way we necessarily want the first time. And so this gives people a chance to have that learning curve before disclosure happens, where we know how someone responds can make a huge difference in someone's healing and well-being. All right, next slide, please. All right, so we just talked about skill building. And now we're going to talk about another strategy, which is diversifying your learning opportunities. And so what this really means, and if you take something away, please try to keep this in mind, is that it's not always going to be a training. And so, when people come to me often saying, I want a training, I really want to have that conversation of, let's dig deeper. Why do you want a training? What's the issue here? Because training really has a specific role, and we want to make sure we use it well. And there can be an over-reliance on training, I think, just in general in our world, but especially in the field of violence prevention. So I always like to start by asking, what needs to be a training and what doesn't? And so trainings are about building knowledge and skills. And I say that with a caveat of sometimes I don't even think it's always about that knowledge piece, because I think we can also give knowledge in lots of different ways that maybe doesn't just include a lecture or a presentation portion. And so we're actually going to talk a little bit more about that. But so I think really thinking, what is the knowledge that people might need to be able to practice and build skills? So really having the connection between those two things, and really thinking that there's lots of ways to share knowledge. And so how do you maximize that time when you're in person or together on Zoom and really connect those two? And then the other thing is really thinking with, should this be a training, is a training isn't going to fix problems that require different solutions. So for example, if it's an issue that's not really about knowledge or skills, training is not going to address the issue. So for example, if it's around an issue of organizational culture, maybe where there's a lot of tensions or attitudes on how people treat each other in the workplace, a training is not going to necessarily address those things. And so here's like another example of where maybe people might jump to a training, but it might not be the right thing. So thinking about time management, if there's a new staff member, and let's say they're relatively new to the workforce, and they're often late in completing tasks. And the impact is that it can make others feel disrespected, but it also creates stress in the workplace, and it really impacts the workplace culture, where people feel a lot more stressed, there's a lot more tensions, it comes out how people treat each other. So if someone came to me with this and said, I want a training to address this, I would say, should this be a training? Let's dig a little bit deeper. Because there could be lots of things behind this issue. So for example, perhaps this person needs some accommodations to be able to best do their work. Or maybe they're not being given all of the resources needed to be able to do their work, and that's why it's taking them longer in tasks. Or maybe that the timeframes are just too short for someone, or maybe their workload is too much, or they're working on too many projects all at once. There's so many things that could be impacting this. So you could do a training for the entire staff on time management skills and thinking about respect and things like that. But the truth is you don't really understand the issue here. It doesn't seem widespread, and so training is probably not the right solution. So you really want to be strategic. But that doesn't mean is you don't address something or you don't provide education and learning. So next slide, please. So I would love for us to do a brainstorm and feel like we can get as much as possible in the chat here of what are types of education and learning that are not a training. I just want to say I'm seeing a comment from Rachel of I feel it's a good opportunity to define workplace values for everyone. And I think that's great too. And so even thinking about that, how might you do that? How is that, what type of education and learning might that be? So I'd love to just see as much as possible in the chat. This is great. I'm seeing coaching, supervision, mentorship, videos, reading. What else can we get in this list? Mentoring, sensitivity coaching, learning circles. One-on-ones with supervisors. That's fantastic. Experiential learning by doing. Yep, so much from experiential education, fish bowls, Havruta, leaning on sort of our Jewish practices there with one-on-one learning, infographics, peer groups. This is an amazing list. And I think that this is so important to be able to brainstorm and really think creatively. And actually, Eva, this is perfect. Theater, arts in general. So there's so many ways that we can communicate information that doesn't necessarily be a training and might be a lot stronger in a different format. Yep, I'm seeing shul, sermons. This is fantastic. And so we actually have a resource. So next slide, please. And I won't go over this because I think we covered a lot of this, but there's a handout that Stephanie just put in the chat. But so we covered a lot of these things, but so thinking also observation, online self-led courses, reading an article together and discussing it, doing pre-work before training. I love when someone said videos, that could also be pre-work for a training. So you maximize that time together. Folks could read an article or watch a video and then discuss it together, which is definitely going to stick with people more than just watching a video together. Fantastic. All right. So let's actually practice applying this. So next slide, please. We're going to do another scenario together. So there is an employee in your office who often makes comments about other people's bodies. This has included comments such as, "That dress looks great on you, Ari. You look so much thinner." And "Wow, I wish I could eat that many hamantaschen and still have my butt look that good." So let's take this apart a little bit. What's the problem? What's the questions to ask yourself about how to address it? And what kind of learning could be used to address this situation? So if someone wants to come off mute, feel free. Otherwise, you can put your thoughts in the chat. So really starting with what's the problem? What are we seeing here? Body shaming. Yeah, so there's a lot to unpack in those statements. It's not okay to talk about other people's bodies. Yes, body talk in general, unwanted comments about others' bodies. There's a specific employee who's behaving inappropriately, and that person needs to be specifically addressed. That's great, really pulling out that problem there. Yep, unwanted comments about consumption. And so we know that these kinds of statements can create a culture where people don't feel comfortable, where people don't feel safe. And it could also really be harmful too, especially let's say if Ari is in recovery from an eating disorder, or these sorts of comments could really be triggering harmful thoughts for them. So we've identified the problem. And so what are the questions to ask yourself about how to address it? So I started seeing it about like we have pinpointed that it's a specific employee. So what else, like what questions might you ask yourself if you're seeing this? Yes, I'm seeing this of, is this something that has happened before with this person or with others? And so I think that's really important to understand, you know, is this how this person treats one specific employee or everyone in the organization? Because both are harmful, but you might address it a little bit differently. Anything else folks might ask about how they would address it? This is great. What is this person's intent? Do they understand how the comments are affecting others? Thinking about intent versus impact. I love those two because that really might change how you address it. You still need to address it. It's clearly a problem, but that might shape how you're approaching it. And then I also think this is great. What are formats this employee has received feedback best? So really thinking, how is this person going to hear this feedback? And then have other people make comments like this. Has this been addressed by the organization, if at all? So really trying to understand, is this an issue with one person? Is this widespread? How does this impact the culture? All right, so we've thought about what the problem is. We've thought about what questions to ask yourself. So now we know that we need to do something. There needs to be some type of learning and education around this, but what might that be? So I would love to hear what are kind of types of learning that people might put in here. Give everyone a minute to type their responses, and also feel free to come off mute if you want to as well. Yes, so I'm getting a comment about looking at the power dynamics here around who says it. I think that's really, really important because this scenario could look lots of different ways based on different identities. And I think that's a really important piece to unpack with this scenario of really trying to understand what are all of the complex dynamics here and identifying who has power and what is it looking like and how might you address it. And I think if you ignore that power piece, you're not necessarily getting to the root of the issue here.
Yeah, I can see, I'm the one who sent the comment. So I'm just thinking a lot about the nature of power dynamics in organizations and how interventions as well as preventative strategies are so deeply determined by where the sort of problem is coming from. And I'm really curious, like I've seen this happen in things like this happen in multiple organizations and involving different power dynamics. And I will say that when it comes from the top, it is a lot harder to address it. And I'm curious where folks have felt like that there is just sort of lip service versus actual repair and actual implementable. And one of my colleagues in the breakout group just said sort of digestible strategy.
Love that question. I would love to pose that to the group.
Yeah.
I'll also say that's not an easy question to ask, and that there's a lot of things going on there. And it's also such an important question to be asking. So one thing I can say when thinking about that and sort of the power dynamics of, I think it would look really different if it's top leadership versus someone else. And I think especially how an organization might address it, because you would need someone, I think, if it's coming from the very top, to be able to have those conversations. And that's also part of why it's really important to have a policy that no one is exempt from, and also have kind of clear mechanisms of who people can go to for support, regardless of who that harm might be coming from.
Just add on to that, Amy, is that when we think about our Keilim committees, and that's what we encourage organizations to do when we're thinking about this work, is like also having that Keilim committee be a cross section of the organization. So having people at every position and at various different, so having, if you're having a specific Keilim committee, like a subcommittee on education and strategy, and making sure that you have people in positions from every, and there's with internal checks and balances there. So like, even if you encounter, oh, this is a person in position of leadership, they have bought in and they have agreed to the certain parameters of this is what's in the policy and this is what is in our Keilim committee. And that's one of the ways that we found of keeping accountability, even with people in position of leadership, is when you have a kind of group coming together saying this is what we've agreed on, that can sometimes put pressure on folks that may otherwise feel exempt from some of these processes.
Thank you for adding that, Stephanie. Seeing a lot of great answers in the chat. I'm not going to go over all of these right now, but I'm seeing kind of having conversations, addressing it directly, which is so important because often we just don't do feedback in the workplace, and that's so important. Coaching, looking at performance management, and then also thinking about team discussions. And I think I'm also seeing a comment too. So about education and learning, kind of versus direct feedback and conversation. I think those things are often linked. So for me here, like looking at this scenario, one of the things I'd be asking myself is how widespread is this issue? But I for sure know this is an issue with this one person and it needs to be addressed with that one person. I could do a whole training for the organization talking about body shaming, but if this person doesn't recognize that the statements they're making are problematic and harmful, and that's not directly addressed with them, that training is going to be read in lots of different ways. And it might also create feelings for other people of saying, well, I see this all the time from one specific person. Why isn't it being addressed that way? So I think that's also the question of when you're looking at issues in the workplace of, when is it a performance issue that you need to directly address, especially through direct feedback and conversation, versus thinking about education for everyone? And often those aren't unconnected. Everyone can benefit from thinking about harmful comments in the workplace around bodies. And with this particular scenario, doing a training for everyone, that's not really going to address this issue here. And so this is where there's one of those scenarios you want to say, well, is training the right approach? Is that the right strategy here with thinking about education and learning? Or is there something else that I should be thinking about? I want to cover a few more strategies for folks, just so folks kind of know them. Lots of these are linked to different resources. So next slide, please. All right, so the next effective strategy is continued engagement. And so there's two questions here to always be asking. How are you ensuring a training is not a one-off? And how are you building in follow-up opportunities? And so with this, you really want to think, again, strategy, the word of the day, but really making sure that if you do decide a training is the right format, and as we've talked about, often it can be, thinking about how do you make sure that it's not just going to be, a few hours in one day that's never discussed again. So really thinking about, how might you create time in a staff meeting to discuss it, or maybe reading an article, or maybe making it a two-part training and a few months later revisiting it. So there's lots of ways to do this, but you really want to think about that before and as you're designing that training opportunity so it doesn't become a one-off. And next slide, please. Great. So then we get a lot of questions about this too, of how do you choose the right trainer? So we actually made a list of questions to ask when you're looking at a trainer. So this could be for someone internally or someone externally. But one of the things we do know from the research on violence prevention is having a well-trained and effective trainer means like a world of difference on the effectiveness. And so what that means is that you really want to look for someone who's experienced in the type of training you're providing. So for example, if someone's background is in policy development, they might not be the right person for bystander intervention if they have no experience in that. That's a very specific skill set that people with a huge body of evidence there. So you want to make sure that that you're choosing the right trainer for the right topic. And so that's really important because people have lots of different skills. And so you want to make sure that it's the right match for what your goals are with that training. You also want to make sure that they're using evidence-based materials so that they are familiar with what the literature says, they know, what is pointing towards effectiveness, and that they're also really focusing on the experiences of those most directly impacted. So how are they incorporating survivor voices, and how is the purpose of the training to support people who've experienced harm? Also, you want to think about questions of how are they going to use principles of effective adult learning. So really thinking about how do adults learn? And it's not by lecture or just by PowerPoint. So it's a lot of some of the pieces we've already talked about. And then also making sure that they're really thinking holistically about pre and post training engagement and evaluation. So thinking, how are they going to evaluate the effectiveness, and what do those follow-up opportunities look like? And next slide, please. All right, we're going to do one more quick scenario before we wrap up. So you surveyed your staff to learn more about what topics they want on related to sexual harassment and discrimination. So just noting that's that assessment piece and involving other people and for buy-in. So you saw that there's a large interest in how to navigate microaggressions and harmful statements in the workplace. You decide to bring in a trainer to lead a training on bystander intervention in the workplace. So what questions would you ask when vetting trainers? So feel free to put in the chat, what are some things you might ask? And while people are brainstorming those, I also want to share that SRE has been working on a great resource. That's a list of consultants and trainers that different organizations have used. And that's actually another really key thing of choosing good trainers, is choosing folks that other people have recommended and can say, we use them for this training on this topic and they did a great job. Or if we were to do it again, maybe we'd ask them to approach it this way. That's something that you could be thinking about too. And I believe that resource is coming soon, and I will, at the end of this, just pass it over to Samantha to share. And then I just want to share one last effective strategy. So next slide, please. And so thinking about interactive, engaging, and varied teaching methods. So we know people learn best in lots of different ways, and that we know with violence prevention, that having lots of different methodologies makes the information more applicable to people. So you want to think about adult learning practices. You want to think about relevant examples and making sure that things are actually tailored to the audience you're using. And so if it doesn't feel relevant to people, the information is not going to stick with them. And then thinking about different types of teaching methods. So things like videos, group discussions, pairs, reflection, there's so many things, but so making sure that you're really putting in different types. And then that people learn differently. And so give people different opportunities to interact and engage with the material. And let's see, next slide, please. I'm going to skip this one, but would want people to just think too, when you're ever asked to design something or think about supporting a training, of really thinking about what's been effective and engaging for you, and how might you take that really amazing learning experience you had and apply it to things that you're trying to design for others. All right, and next slide. So we'll actually come back to this in one more slide. I'm going to do a little bit of last framing. I want to share this quote because there's a lot of information here. And I think that there's a lot of wisdom in our Jewish traditions. And so it is not your duty to complete the work, but neither are you free to desist from it. And so part of living your policy, and really what this whole module is about, is realizing that honestly, the work's never going to be done. We can always grow. We can always evolve, both as people and as organizations. And it's about taking those steps and living our values towards creating safer, more respectful, and more equitable workplaces. And so I think we'll do one last very quick activity and then pass it back to SRE. I believe we'll be putting on the whiteboard feature on Zoom. Perfect. And one of the reasons we wanted to do this whiteboard is because it is a great tool when thinking about interaction with virtual trainings. So I would like everyone to take a second and commit to one action step that your organization can take after today's session. So how will you think about taking this information and applying it? So thinking about how you share and communicate your policy and how you educate and train others on it. And so people should be able to write on here, and just feel free to write. Yep, I'm seeing people putting lots of great things. So creating a training schedule, education plan, YouTube, I'm seeing YouTube videos, formalizing processes. I love that. That's wonderful. Signage, that's a great one. So really thinking about how you can show your policy so people can access it in different ways. Connecting with my HR team to better understand their policies, training, education plan, and calendar. I love that. And so that this work doesn't happen in a silo and it happens with other people. These are great. Let's see. Finally getting a board training on the calendar. I love that one. And I love on the calendar because the calendar also still implies a strategy because you're looking over the course of a year. I'm seeing lots of +1 for creating a training schedule and education plan. A few more, create an annual schedule for sharing our policy. I love that. All right, we can take down this and we can share out some of these, and please feel free to keep putting in the chat to really make a commitment for an action step you're going to do. And I will pass it back to Samantha.
Well, thank you so much for joining us to learn today. I feel like the last 90 minutes just flew by. A special thanks to Amee and Stephanie for sharing their wisdom and expertise with us, and everyone who really participated in sharing ideas and experiences and questions today. I know I'm walking away with so many ideas and just food for thought to process about what's next. We'll be sending out the follow-up materials in the next few days, which will include the recordings, the Keilim policy toolkit, all of the different resources that we referenced today, and the new resource from SRE with the list of consultants and trainers that our member organizations have worked with and have had good experiences with. Your feedback is really important to us every time you join us for a program. So we'd love to take a quick eval poll, which should take less than a minute. We're going to launch a Zoom poll on the screen for you to take. And while you're doing that, I want to lift up two amazing learning opportunities that are coming up with SRE Network. The first is Hevruta Learning Partners, which is an opportunity to match with a fellow SRE Network member to learn from each other and share your SRE experiences, bright spots, challenges. It's a great opportunity to connect and learn. This might be the right opportunity for you if you are interested in processing what you learned today and talking about, the next steps you're going to take, and having a partner who's engaged in this process too, so you can, support each other in this journey. If you're looking for ideas for your SRE work based on what other organizations are doing, if you're navigating a challenge or question and you want a thought partner, or if you just want to meet others who are working to build safe, equitable, and respectful workplaces, this is going to be a really wonderful new opportunity that SRE is offering. I'll send out the link in the follow-up email. And finally, we hope you will join us at our convening this June in person in New York City on June 6th to 7th. So I hope you'll save the date. Much more information will be coming out shortly. But overall, we're just really grateful for this community to come together and learn together and support each other, and be, on this shared journey together. Amee really left us, I felt like, with some inspiring words of, each of us has a responsibility to move it forward. So thank you. And I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, everyone.